Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever loved someone quietly, so deeply it never needed words? If that thought pulls at something inside you, stay with me. This story may be exactly what your heart's been waiting for. And if you'd like more moments like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It means more than you know. They say you always remember the sound of your mother's voice. For me, it's the way she used to hum in the kitchen, softly, almost like a prayer, as she stirred her morning tea. That sound carried through the walls of our little dress shop in Portland, like sunlight through gauze. Her songs never changed. Old Vietnamese lullabies and American hymns woven into one woman's fragile resilience. I hadn't heard her sing in years. Now, I sat in a grand dressing room in Connecticut, wearing the wedding dress I'd stitched myself, ivory silk, hand-embroidered, hem, tiny pearls tucked into every seam. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever made, and I had made it to wear to a marriage I didn't choose. Outside the windows, mist drifted across the lawn like ghost smoke. The manor was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. My name is Amelia Nguyen. I'm 23. Until this morning, I'd never kissed anyone. I'd never held someone's hand for too long. I'd lived above, the shop with my mother, threading needles and measuring waists and making gowns for other people's beginnings. I never expected my own would begin like this. My father hadn't looked me in the eyes when he told me about the arrangement. "This is the only way," he said, placing a folded contract on the counter between us. His hands trembled. His voice cracked like a broken zipper. "He's agreed to clear the debt, everything, but only if I married him." His name was Alexander Vin, 40, a self-made CEO, born in San Jose, raised in boarding schools, now owner of one of the largest equity firms in New York. They called him the Cold King on finance blogs. A man who never smiled, never lost a deal, never looked twice at a woman unless she wore a company name. We met only once before the wedding. He arrived at the shop, unannounced, on a rainy Thursday. I remember the smell of his coat, cedar and wet wool. He didn't take off his gloves, didn't sit, just stood, scanned the rows of gowns, then turned to me and said, "You'll marry me next Friday. I've settled your father's liabilities. It's done." That was all. No proposal. No conversation. No ring. Just a transaction wrapped in legalese and a steel voice. And I said yes, not out of love, not out of desire, out of loyalty to my mother, lying weak and pale in the backroom bed, out of a daughter's guilt and a seamstress's sense of duty to hold things together, no matter how broken. Now, on this gray morning, a maid with tight lips pinned the final curl into my hair. The silence was so complete I could hear the clock ticking down the hall. "Miss Nguyen," she said, "he's waiting. He, not your husband, not Mr. Vin, just he." Like a figure in a legend no one dared name. The ballroom was golden and empty, gold-trimmed walls, an ornate chandelier dripping with crystal, and a long red carpet that led me straight into something I hadn't agreed to feel. He stood at the far end, wearing a black suit that looked like it cost more than our shop ever, made in a year. No smile, no curiosity. His gaze was neutral, sharp and gray like early morning ash. I walked toward him, heels clicking against the marble. No vows were spoken. No music played. Only two signatures, mine and his, and the quiet announcement from a lawyer in a gray suit. "You are now legally wed." I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply nodded, and he nodded back, as if we'd signed a merger and now shared a boardroom. That night, I sat on the edge of a guest bed in the manor's east wing. The sheets were cold. My hands were colder. The dress was hanging on the door, empty and glowing like a ghost. I opened my suitcase to look for my mother's scarf, the one she always carried. Instead, I found something tucked beneath the lining, An envelope. Pale blue. Faint scent of lavender. My mother's handwriting. If you are reading this, then I was not strong enough to stand beside you today. I'm sorry, my little one. I tried to stop this. I tried to make your father see reason. But the past is heavier than love sometimes. Do not hate him. He was once a good man. He just forgot what love costs. If you meet the man I once met, if it is him, you must know, I saw kindness in his eyes. He was not cruel, only broken. I pray he still is. My breath caught. I read the last line 3 times. Love does not always begin with choice. Sometimes, it begins with staying. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. Somewhere downstairs, I heard the closing of a door. Heavy. Final. Like a chapter beginning that hadn't been written by me, but might still, somehow, end with my own hand. The elevator opened with a sigh, and I stepped into what could only be described as silence, wearing silk. Alexander's penthouse was perched on the 59th floor of a glass tower on the Upper East Side. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, letting in the entire Manhattan skyline. I expected noise, the constant pulse of the city. Instead, I heard nothing but my own breath and the soft tick of a minimalist clock embedded into the wall. He didn't show me around. A housekeeper with silver-streaked hair pointed to a bedroom at the far end of the hallway. "This is yours," she said gently. "He's down the hall." Mine. His 2 rooms, 1 marriage, 1 contract. No promises. The room was beautiful in the way hotels are beautiful. Perfect, expensive, and untouched. Pale wood floors. A king-sized bed with crisp gray linens. No photographs. No warmth. I stood by the window for a long time that evening, watching. Tiny people move across the city like threads pulled through fabric. Down there, someone was falling in love. Someone else was making soup for their grandmother. Life went on without knowing I had been folded into a story I didn't ask to join. Alexander didn't come in that night, or the night after. I saw him sometimes in the kitchen. Brief flashes of black suit and cufflinks, the clink of a spoon in his coffee. We didn't speak. He didn't ask if I was comfortable. I didn't ask why he hadn't looked at me since the wedding. But I noticed things, like the teacup left on the marble counter, delicate porcelain with a faint lavender hue, just like the ones we used at the shop. A tiny paper packet beside it, ginger chamomile, the same kind my mother drank every night. No one else could have known that. I didn't drink it. But I didn't throw it away either. 1 week passed. On the 8th night, I fell ill. A sudden fever, sharp and cruel. I tried to stand, but the room spun, and my knees buckled beneath me. I don't remember calling for help. I remember the weight of the blankets, the distant hum of city life. Then the sound of footsteps. Measured. Urgent. When I opened my eyes, he was there. Not the maid. Not a nurse. Alexander. No jacket. No tie. Just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled, his brow furrowed in something that might have been concern. His hand touched my forehead. "You're burning up." I tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. "You came." He didn't answer. He stepped into the bathroom and returned with a damp cloth, knelt beside the bed, and pressed it gently to my forehead. The water was cool, his hand steady. "You should have told someone," he said. I didn't know who to ask. He looked at me then. Really looked. His eyes weren't gray tonight. They were warm ash, softened by something I couldn't name. Not kindness exactly. Not guilt either. Just presence. He sat with me as the fever rose and fell. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking to the faint scent of cedar and lemon balm, the sound of a spoon stirring something in the kitchen. Once I felt his hand brush mine as he adjusted the blankets, slow and unsure, like someone touching memory. In the quiet of that night, I remembered something my mother used to say. Love doesn't always announce itself, Konyu. Sometimes it just stands there, quietly refusing to leave. When morning came, my fever had broken. A bowl of soup sat cooling on the nightstand. Homemade, not from a restaurant. The broth was clear, flavored with ginger and scallions, just the way Mom made it. I sat up slowly and reached for the spoon. That was when I noticed it. Lying next to the tray was my mother's scarf. I hadn't unpacked it. It had been buried deep in the suitcase I hadn't touched since the wedding. I held it to my chest, letting the scent of jasmine and old cotton flood back into me. Tears came. Not from pain, but from something quieter. A recognition. He had looked for it. He had brought it. Without a word. Later that afternoon, I found him on the terrace, his back to me, gazing over the city like a man reading something only he could see. I wanted to thank you, I said. He didn't turn. You don't have to. I want to. Silence. Then softly, almost like a confession. I didn't know you liked ginger tea. I never told anyone, I replied. Except my mother. A pause. Then, she said you once came to the shop before she got sick. Now he turned. Yes, he said simply. I didn't go in. Why? He hesitated. I was afraid she'd recognize me. From what? He didn't answer, just gave a slow shake of his head and returned his gaze to the skyline. That night, as I lay in bed, the letter from my mother under my pillow, I wondered again about the line she had written. If it is him, I saw kindness in his eyes. Maybe she had seen something I hadn't, yet. 2 weeks had passed since the wedding. I began to learn the rhythm of the penthouse, its quiet mornings filled with muted light and polished silence, the soft hum of the espresso machine that ran without a word, the turning of pages in Alexander's study. He spoke little, but I started to sense his presence more clearly, like a figure behind sheer curtains. He never touched me, never asked questions, but every so often, I would find small signs of him tracing the outlines of my life. A folded blanket placed at the foot of my bed, a drawer that no longer squeaked, a book left on my desk, The Art of Repair. No note, just a quiet offering. I began keeping my mother's scarf with me, draped over my shoulders even when I wasn't cold. It felt like armor, or maybe a thread, connecting me to something real. That morning, I was folding laundry in the corner of my room when my phone buzzed. A message from the hospice nurse in Portland. Your mother would like to speak with you. She asked for Alexander. My heart stilled. I hadn't told her much. Just that I was married, that things were stable. I called her immediately. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, like paper held too close to flame. Me, Khan? She whispered, Can I ask you something strange? Anything. Did Alexander ever tell you why he agreed to this marriage? I hesitated. He said it was part of a deal, that the debt would be erased. That's not the whole story. Silence. Then a long breath on the other end of the line. Years ago, your father took something that didn't belong to him. It wasn't money, it was trust. He betrayed Alexander in a business deal, lied, ruined something he was building. I don't know the full details, but I know Alexander could have ruined your father, publicly, permanently, but he didn't. I sat down slowly on the bed, the folded laundry forgotten in my lap. Then why this? He told your Father, he would erase the debt if you agreed to marry him. Not because he wanted revenge, because he said someone needs to teach him what loyalty costs. That doesn't make sense. No, she said gently. But sometimes honor doesn't. I ended the call with a heart that felt both heavier and oddly steadier. I stared out at the skyline, where the city breathed in clouds of late October light, and thought about everything. I didn't understand. That evening, I found him in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, shirt sleeves rolled up, slicing ginger. The smell filled the room, warm, sharp, familiar. I spoke before I lost the courage. You knew he betrayed. You. He paused, knife midair, then continued slicing. Yes. And you still helped him. He didn't look at me. Helping him wasn't the point. I waited. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was unreadable, but his voice was quiet. It wasn't about him, it was about you. He didn't deserve mercy, but you didn't deserve to pay for his failure. This was the only way I knew how to draw a line between who he was and who you might become. That's not how people usually think. I'm not most people. I sat down across from him, the warmth of the ginger rising between us. For the first time, I didn't feel like a stranger in his home. You could have just walked away. I did once, he said, but I looked back. That night, I opened my mother's letter again. I had read it at least 20 times by then, but a line now stood out in a new light. Do not confuse silence with absence. The right people show up in different ways. I realized I had judged him too quickly. His love, if it could be called that, wasn't loud. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't easy. But it was constant, present, quiet as breath. I began to notice how much he carried that he never spoke of. He never asked for thanks, never explained his actions. And maybe that was his way of atoning for something he never said aloud. 2 days later, I asked him if he wanted to visit my mother. She's asked for you, I said. He looked startled, then nodded. I'll come. We flew back to Portland that weekend. The dress shop hadn't changed. Dust still gathered in the corners. The sign was faded but still legible. Marion's stitching room. I brought him through the old door, and for a moment he paused, looking not at the space but at the memory. My mother was thinner than I remembered, but her eyes were clear. When she saw him, she smiled softly. So, she said, you're the one who looked at my daughter and saw a future she couldn't yet believe in. He bowed his head slightly. I wasn't sure she'd ever forgive me. She will, my mother said, when she learns to forgive herself first. I stepped outside and left them alone. Through the window, I watched them talk. Two people who had survived too much loss, too much silence, but still sat together in peace. That evening, Alexander and I walked along the river. The sky was lavender, the trees shedding golden leaves onto the pavement. I looked at him and asked the question that had been haunting me since day one. Why didn't you let me choose? He didn't answer immediately. Then slowly, because I didn't trust myself to wait for your answer. And now? Now, he said, looking at the falling leaves. I'd wait forever if it meant hearing you say yes for real. The wind blew gently through the branches, and in the quiet that followed, I realized something else. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of the future. And maybe, not even of love. The first real cold of November settled into New York like a long sigh. Mornings were slower now, darker. I woke to the hum of the heating vents and the distant clink of Alexander's coffee cup in the kitchen. Life inside the penthouse had grown quieter, but not colder. Somehow the silence between us had shifted, less like a wall, more like a blanket we both held at the corners. We didn't speak often, but when we did, it was different. He asked about my mother, about the shop, about the things I missed. I asked about the city, about the work he did that seemed so far from sewing, machines and tea kettles. We were two people from separate worlds, slowly learning each other's languages without using many words. It was during one of these mornings that the call came. I recognized the nurse's number before I even answered. Her voice was steady, practiced, but it couldn't soften the blow. My mother's condition was worsening, rapidly. "If you want to see her, it should be soon," she said. I sat on the edge of the kitchen stool, the world narrowing into the phone pressed against my ear. My first thought was not about flights or logistics or even grief. It was about how much time I had left to make her proud, to show her that marrying Alexander hadn't been the end of me, but maybe the beginning of something neither of us had dared hope for. Alexander noticed immediately. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer polite condolences. Instead, he placed his hand lightly on the back of my chair, the first time he'd ever touched me without reason or necessity, and said simply, "Pack what you need. I'll take care of everything else." We left that afternoon. The flight back to Portland was heavy with unspoken things. I stared out the window, tracing the lights of towns we passed over, wondering if she was awake, if she knew we were coming. Alexander sat beside me, reading, but I noticed he turned the page less often than usual. When we arrived, the shop was dark. The sign creaked slightly in the wind. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and as the door swung open, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood wrapped around me like a memory. Home. Upstairs in the back bedroom, my mother was sleeping. Her chest rose and fell shallowly beneath the quilt she had stitched herself decades ago. I sat beside her, taking her hand, tracing the lines etched deep into her skin. The same hands that had taught me to sew, to mend, to build. Alexander stood, quietly in the doorway. For a moment, I thought he would leave, give us privacy. But then he stepped inside, pulled up the worn wooden chair beside me, and simply sat. No demands, no expectations, just presence. For days, we stayed there, though three of us, orbiting around the slow, steady heartbeat of a life nearing its close. Alexander took to small tasks without being asked, running to the store for groceries, fixing the broken heater in the front shop, changing the light bulb in the hallway that had flickered for years. I caught him once, late at night, sitting at the old kitchen table, scribbling something into a small leather notebook with a frown of deep concentration. When he saw me, he closed it quickly, almost shyly. "Work?" I teased, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "Just things I don't want to forget." One night, as the first snow began to dust the sidewalks outside, my mother woke fully for the first time in days. Her eyes found mine, immediately, then drifted past me to Alexander. "You stayed," she said, voice cracked and small. "Yes," he answered simply. She smiled, weak but unmistakable. "Then it was worth it." She drifted back to sleep after that, but her words stayed with me, warming the hollow spaces inside my chest. A few days later, the nurse pulled me aside. "It's time to start thinking about arrangements," she said gently. I nodded, numb, the edges of the world blurring at the thought. That night, Alexander cooked dinner. A simple soup, rich with ginger and garlic, the way my mother used to make it when either of us had a cold. I sat at the counter, watching him move with awkward care around the kitchen. He burned the onions slightly, forgot the salt, but he kept trying. That, more than anything, unraveled something tight inside me. "You don't have to do this," I said quietly. He looked up, brow furrowed. I know. Then why? He set the spoon down, leaning his hands on the counter, searching for words. Because this is the only thing I can give you right now that matters. I didn't know what to say. So I just stood, crossed the small space between us, and placed my hand over his. His skin was warm, steady, real. We stayed like that for a long moment. No grand declarations, no sweeping promises. Just two people in a small kitchen, clinging to the fragile, ordinary miracle of trying. Later that evening, when the snow fell heavier, I sat beside my mother's bed again. Alexander had fallen asleep in the armchair, arms crossed loosely over his chest, head tilted back against the worn upholstery. I leaned over and whispered into her ear. I'm not afraid anymore, Me. You were right. Love doesn't always begin with choice. Sometimes it begins when someone refuses to leave. I felt her fingers twitch lightly around mine, and for a second, I allowed myself to believe she had heard me. My mother passed on a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where the sun barely bothers rising, where even the birds seem to speak in hushed tones. She slipped away in her sleep, her hand still wrapped loosely around mine, as if she were just resting. When the nurse came in, she touched my shoulder softly. She waited for you to let go, she said. You did right by her. I didn't cry. Not at first. Instead, I sat for a long time beside her, memorizing the shape of her face in the pale light, the stillness of her breathless chest, the faint scent of lavender and something warmer, ginger maybe, lingering on the quilt. Alexander didn't speak. He stood at the doorway like he had so many mornings before, a silent sentry. But this time, he stepped forward, gently pulled the covers up over my mother's shoulders, even though she no longer needed them. I watched him as he adjusted the edges with surprising care, as though this act could somehow soften what had already happened. Then, without a word, he took my hand and led me downstairs. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I learned how to pin a hem, where my mother used to peel apples with practiced grace. There was tea already made. I didn't ask how he knew I would need it. I'm not sure what to do next, I admitted. You grieve, he said simply. You give yourself permission. We didn't say much more. He let the silence be what it was: complete, weighty, necessary. Later that afternoon, I began sorting through her things. Folded scarves, stacks of fabric, still marked with chalk lines she never got around to cutting. At the bottom of a wooden sewing box, I found a small envelope. Pale ivory. My name written in the flowing, careful script I had known all my life. Opened it with shaking fingers. Amelia, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to explain in person. But I wanted to leave you with more than memories. I wanted to leave you with truth. I once made the mistake of thinking love had to look a certain way. Loud. Sure. Effortless. I spent years trying to shape your father into the man I thought. I wanted only to realize too late that love is often quieter, smaller, and infinitely more courageous than we expect. Alexander is not perfect. But neither are you, and neither was I. What matters is that when life pressed in, he stayed, and so did you. Don't underestimate that. If he lets you in, Amelia, and if you are brave enough to stay, I believe there's a kind of happiness waiting that even I never found. I pressed the letter to my chest and wept, not just for her absence, but for the years we lost before she could say these things aloud. For the courage it must have taken her to write them, for the quiet, flawed love she believed I could still find. That night, I laid the letter on Alexander's desk. I didn't say anything. I simply placed it there and left. I found him hours later, not in his study, but on the back porch of the house. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, steady flakes drifting down like silent forgiveness. He was sitting alone, the letter open, in his lap, his eyes unreadable. "She wrote that before we even met," I said quietly. He nodded. "I know. Did you ever talk to her? Before all this?" "Once," he replied. "I came to the shop, didn't go in, but I saw her through the window. She was laughing. With you." I remember thinking, I didn't want to be the reason that laugh disappeared. I sat down beside him. "You weren't," I said. "Grief did that. But it doesn't have to last forever." We sat like that for a long time, shoulder to shoulder, watching the snow gather in silence. The world was still and cold and strangely full of grace. Later, back inside, I made tea. 2 cups. I added a spoonful of honey to mine, just like Mom used to do, and brought the other to Alexander. He took it without a word, held it with both hands like he needed its warmth more than he'd admit. Then he looked at me, not with the cool distance of a man keeping a contract, but with the steady, unspoken ache of someone who wanted to stay but didn't quite know how. "I've never grieved with someone before," he said quietly. "Me neither," I replied. "But we're learning." That night, we sat by the fire, my legs curled beneath me, his long frame folded into the armchair across from mine. We didn't speak of the letter again, but something had changed. Not in the way we looked at each other, but in what we were willing to let the other person see. Before we went to bed, he paused in the hallway. I had already turned to go to my room, but his voice stopped me. I read the part where she said, "Love doesn't always look like we expect." I turned back toward him. "She was right," he said. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I want to learn what it looks like with you." I didn't answer. I just reached out, touched his hand. And for the first time, neither of us let go. The days after the funeral passed in slow, suspended motion. I moved through them as though wading waist-deep in memory, folding my mother's clothes, packing up shelves of thread and fabric she would never use again. Alexander stayed with me through it all, rarely speaking, always present. He fixed the creaking back door, repainted the windows, replaced the bulbs in the sewing lamps. Little by little, the shop started to breathe again, as if it, too, were finding a way to keep living. One afternoon, I found him sitting at the counter near the front window, staring out at the sidewalk, a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. He didn't look up when I approached. "Have you ever thought," he said slowly, "about what silence protects?" I sat beside him. "Silence can protect love," I said, "but it can also bury it." He nodded, still watching the street. I spent years thinking if I said nothing, I couldn't be blamed. That if I just worked, just built, I could control the damage. But sometimes, not saying anything causes more harm than speaking badly. He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't push. Some truths have to surface on their own. We were supposed to return to New York that weekend, but I asked for one more day. Just one. I needed to close the shop one last time with my own hands. Alexander agreed without question. That night, I locked the door, turned the sign to closed, and left the keys on the counter where my mother always placed her needle box. It felt like the end of a song. The next morning, we flew back. New York greeted us with sleet and wind. The penthouse felt different, less sterile, more familiar, as if my time away had softened the edges of the silence that used to hang in the corners. Alexander placed my bags in the hallway, then paused. "There's something you should know," he said. I turned. "My half-sister is in town. She requested to meet you." The word requested didn't sit right. It carried the weight of a challenge more than an invitation. I nodded slowly. All right. The meeting was set for the following evening. A quiet dinner at his townhouse in the West Village, smaller, older, and more intimate than the penthouse. When we arrived, the lights were low, the fire already lit. The woman who greeted us was tall, elegant, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. Her name was Margot. "So you're Amelia," she said, her voice smooth but distant. I replied, offering my hand. She didn't take it. "Interesting," she said, stepping back. "You don't look like the type he'd marry. But then again, he's always had strange taste when guilt gets involved." I felt Alexander tense beside me. "Margot," he said, quietly. "This isn't—" "No," she cut in. "It's fine. I'm just curious. How does it feel, Amelia, being the charity case? The girl who was bought to fix someone else's debt? Must be exhausting pretending to fit into a world that doesn't want you." I could feel the old fear rising, that ache in my chest that told me to run, to retreat, to be small. But something else came with it. Something new. "I don't pretend," I said. "I didn't ask to be here, but I've stayed. That's more than some people manage." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Sharp. He's taught you well." "I taught myself," I said. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Alexander stepped between us. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. Margot didn't argue. She just nodded once, turned, and left the room. I didn't speak until we got back to the car. My hands were shaking, but I kept them folded in my lap. "Why didn't you warn me?" I asked. He stared out the window. "I thought if I said nothing, I could protect you from her, and instead, I walked in blind." "I know." His voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want you to see that part of my life. The way my family carries rot under fine clothing." "I'm not afraid of rot," I said, "but I need the truth, even when it's ugly, especially then." He nodded slowly. "You're right." We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it wasn't the same silence we'd known before. This one was bruised and necessary. That night, I stood alone in the living room, staring at the old city through frost-touched windows. I thought of my mother, of her letters, of how she taught me that love isn't a promise, it's a decision. One you make every day, especially when it's hard. I didn't want to be someone he shielded. I wanted to be someone he trusted. When Alexander entered the room, I didn't turn around. "I'm going back to Portland," I said softly. He stopped. For how long, I don't know. Silence. "Is this because of Margot?" "No. It's because of what you didn't say. I can't stay in a marriage where silence is the strongest voice in the room." I waited. And then finally, he crossed the space between us. "I thought I was doing what was best," he said. "But I see now that I was only protecting myself, not you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, leather-bound, the notebook. He handed it to me. Inside were notes, pages of thoughts, lists, sketches, memories, dates and phrases, my name. I wrote everything I was, too afraid to say out loud, he said. "But if you're willing to stay, I'll learn to speak. I promise." I opened to the first page. At the top, in simple handwriting, were 4 words. "Don't let her leave." I looked up. His eyes were no longer cold, just human. I stepped closer, lifted the notebook between us. "Then start here," I said. "Say it." He swallowed. "Don't let her leave." I nodded. That's a good start. We didn't talk about Margot again. After that night, things between Alexander and me became quieter, but not in the old way. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was carefulness. A new rhythm trying to form, like two people learning to dance with each other for the first time. Watching, waiting, adjusting their steps. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't promise I would. But I didn't pack my bags either. Instead, we started changing the space around us. We moved into the old townhouse on Perry Street. His, but never really lived in. It needs warmth, I had said, more to myself than to him. He took it seriously. The next day, a delivery truck arrived with throw blankets, ceramic lamps, tea tins, and kitchen tools that had clearly never been used. If we're going to live here, he said, we should actually live here. There was no staff, no schedules, no expectations. Just two people trying to figure out if comfort could grow where silence once lived. We cooked together most evenings. I taught him how to stir without bruising the herbs, how to chop garlic without rushing. He showed me how to reset the breaker when the power flickered, how to fix a leaking faucet without calling anyone. Small things, maybe. But they added up. One evening, while we were hanging a new set of linen curtains, Alexander paused halfway, through pinning the fabric, and looked at me. "You make this place feel like it has a heartbeat," he said. I smiled. It's not the place. It's what we let ourselves carry into it. Sometimes I caught him reading the notebook. He never hid it from me anymore. He kept it on the nightstand, a kind of open diary. Every few days, I'd flip through it while folding laundry or brewing tea. New entries appeared slowly. Words like, "Asked her to teach me to hem a shirt." She didn't laugh. I think I like the way she leans into silence. Tried her soup recipe. Failed, but she said thank you anyway. None of it was dramatic. None of it grand. And yet, in its simplicity, it held more meaning than all the meetings and mergers he'd ever commanded. One Sunday morning, I found him on the small balcony, sipping coffee, wearing an old sweater I didn't recognize. He looked at peace. Not happy, maybe, but grounded. He gestured for me to join him. I brought my tea. After a long silence, he spoke without turning. I bought the shop. I blinked. "The one in Portland?" He nodded. "Your mother's name is still on the lease. I'm having the sign restored. Same name, same window. But I thought maybe it could be more than memory now. Maybe something for you. For us." I didn't answer right away. The emotion came too fast, too big. I placed my mug down, looked out at the city, the trees bare, the wind soft. "I thought you hated small things," I said eventually. "Shops, towns, things that don't scale." "I used to," he replied. "Until I realized some things aren't supposed to scale. They're supposed to stay small so they can stay real." He turned then, fully, and looked at me. "I didn't just buy it for you. I bought it because I needed a reminder of who you are, and what you've helped me remember about myself." I reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. Later that day, we walked through Central Park. The air was brisk, sharp with the smell of dried leaves and street vendors' roasted nuts. We passed an older couple feeding birds on a bench. The woman wore a navy coat with tiny white buttons. She leaned into the man as he wrapped a scarf around her shoulders. No rush, no fanfare. Just an ordinary moment etched in something like eternity. "I want that," I said softly. Alexander followed my gaze. "Me too." We didn't need to say what that meant. We were already beginning to build it, imperfectly, slowly, but with intention. That night, he asked me, "Do you miss her the most in the morning or at night?" I smiled through the lump in my throat. "Both." He nodded. "Maybe grief doesn't shrink. Maybe we just grow around it." I think she'd be proud of you, I said. Of this. Of how you've stayed. He didn't respond with words. He just took my hand again. But this time, it wasn't to stop me from leaving. It was to ask, silently, if I might finally be choosing to stay. And I did. I stayed. Spring returned to the city in its quiet, persistent way. Not with a grand entrance, but in soft acts of mercy. Buds on bare branches, golden light slanting through windows at dinner time, the smell of something warm blooming beneath the sidewalks. The townhouse filled with that kind of light too. Not the harsh glare of success or spectacle, but the slow, filtered glow of a life being lived gently. We didn't speak of marriage right away. Not because we were avoiding it, but because it no longer felt urgent. We had already built the pieces of it. The shared mornings, the 2 mugs on the kitchen counter, the rhythm of grocery lists written in both our hands. Sometimes, love doesn't knock. Sometimes it grows roots before you even realize it has a name. But then, one evening in early May, Alexander surprised me. We were folding laundry together, something we now did without thinking. He was halfway through pairing socks when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn box. No velvet, no theatrics, just something simple and held with care. "This belonged to your mother," he said. "She gave it to me the day you first returned to Portland. Said I should keep it until I learned what it meant to deserve it." He opened it. Inside was a silver ring, slim, engraved, slightly weathered. I knew it instantly. My mother's wedding. Ring. She had worn it long after my father had stopped coming home on time, long after the words between them had turned to silence. She said it didn't belong to the man who gave it to her anymore. Alexander added, she wanted it to go to someone who would learn to stay. I didn't say anything at first, just stared at the ring, heart tightening in that quiet, reverent way grief and joy sometimes come together. "I'm not asking for anything grand," he said, voice low. "Just this. Stay with me. Keep choosing me, as I keep choosing you. Every morning, every mistake, every bowl of burnt soup." I laughed softly, even as tears stung the corners of my eyes. "Yes," I said, "but only if you promise to keep overcooking the onions. It's tradition now." He smiled. A real one, unguarded, uneven. Mine. We married under the canopy of a blooming tree in the backyard of the townhouse. Just a few close friends. No suits of power, no articles, no guest. List curated for optics. He wore a navy jacket and no tie. I wore a simple cream dress, and my mother's scarf wrapped around my shoulders. We exchanged vows we had written separately, but somehow mirrored each other. Promises not of perfection, but of presence. He said, "I'll never try to own you. Only love you the way you are." I said, "I won't walk away when the silence returns. I'll learn to speak into it." When it was time for the ring, he placed it gently on my finger and whispered, "Mine," softly. Not possessive, not afraid, just present. That evening, we curled up in the living room, the windows open to let in the spring breeze. Our hands tangled beneath the blanket. The fire was low, humming in the hearth. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. On the table beside us sat a new notebook, this one shared. The first page held a title in both our handwriting. Things we're still learning. We took turns filling it in. His first entry: how to let her win an argument without feeling like I lost. Mine: how to trust that love doesn't disappear when the room goes quiet. There were pages left blank. That was the point. A few weeks later, we traveled back to Portland. The shop had been cleaned, restored, repainted. The new sign gleamed, softly above the door, Marian's stitching room. Inside, everything looked the same, but more hopeful, like a space waiting to welcome stories again. We opened the doors quietly. No ribbon cutting, no fanfare. Just a soft, open sign turned over by my hand, and the sound of wind chimes ringing gently as we stepped back inside. I ran my fingers across the counter, over the grain of wood my mother had leaned on for decades. Alexander stood beside me, a quiet presence. "You were right," I said. "About what?" "Some things aren't meant to scale. They're meant to be held close, protected." He nodded. "So is love." We brewed tea in the back room, ginger chamomile, just like always. While the kettle whistled, I noticed a small envelope tucked into the corner of the cupboard. It was yellowed with age, but addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in a long time. For when she finally understands. Inside was a single line, written in my mother's careful script. "He was always yours, Kongai. He just didn't know how to say it." I closed the note, tucked it back into the cupboard. Then I returned to the front room, where Alexander stood adjusting a bolt of fabric on the display shelf. "Hey," I said softly. He turned. I smiled. "You're home now. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider giving it a like. It helps more than you know. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next quiet, heartfelt journey we'll share together. Until